Population in transition. What do we mean by this? Well, first of all, you have to think in terms of population change. So we have 7.4 billion people on this planet right now. 3 billion of those will be entering the reproductive years. And so you might be thinking, well, gosh darn it, the Earth is doomed. We're going to be overpopulated. And you know what? You're probably right, but maybe not. We have two things here we want to talk about: preventative checks and positive checks. In terms of preventative, these are things that happen maybe before you have children. So delayed marriage, or maybe abstinence and having fewer children in the first place. Positive happens after the fact, so things like famine, disease, and war. Less desirable. Now, you might be thinking, well, alongside this population change, we also have, as the population increases, an increase in demand for resources. And while that is true, this is not on a global scale in terms of food shortage. In fact, if anything, the limit of food for people comes down to affordability and availability at a regional scale. So what I mean by that is there's a surplus margin of food production in other regions versus others. So maybe in South Africa, they have to import a lot of foods, or maybe in Japan. That's what we're talking about when we say regional scale. And oftentimes, this pessimistic view that actually really originates from the 1970s, it's missing the fact that humans are not only consumers, but producers at the same time. There are four main trends you want to keep track of. First, the population is definitely increasing. But while that's happening, the growth rate is going down, and so is the death rate or mortality rate. And while this is happening, the average life expectancy has been continually increasing across regions, especially in developing countries. What is replacement level? Well, it's if each woman were to have 2.1 children. You can't have a tenth of a child, but this is an average. You want to know about population structures, and more specifically, the population pyramid. On the left-hand side in blue, we have the males, right-hand side females. You might notice it has a pretty wide base here. So a lot of people in their reproductive years approaching them, as well as in their 30s to 40s, and then it dips off, and you have fewer people who are in the elderly range. So pretty well-sized, dependent population here, I suppose. Now, if you were to draw a triangle, you might notice it has a pretty a wide base. But in the case of a developed country, or maybe the base will be smaller, and as you go further up towards the elderly population, it gets wider. And so that is a trend you want to identify. Less economically developed countries, LEDCs, will have a wider base typically. They're more reproductive, have a higher fertility rate. And in the case of an MEDC, more economically developed country, this will have a smaller base and a greater elderly population. In both cases, pretty big dependent populations for the most part. Alright, now down to demographics here. You want to know what natural increase here is, and that is basically the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate per 1,000 people. And when you take into account the birth rate, you want to add the net migration on top of that. So what does crude mean in this case? Well, typically, that means per 1,000 people. So say you got 9.5 million annual deaths in India, and you have a population of about 1.3 billion. You divide that 9.5 million by the 1.3 billion, and that gives you a decimal, which is about 0.7%. But keep that in decimal form, and what happens is when you multiply that by 1,000, you get about 7 people per 1,000 unit. And that's the crude death rate in this case. And if you were to subtract that from the crude birth rate, which is the same thing, but instead you take the birth rates and maybe you add on top of that net migration, then you get your CBR. Another one, population momentum factor, PMF. This is the tendency to continue growing despite if they were at replacement level, or 2.1 children per woman. That is a key part there. And the way you calculate this is by CBR times the life expectancy at birth, and then all of that divided by 1,000. So make sure you have your calculators for this. Now, in the case of America, on average, per year, we get about 4 million babies being born, and the total population adds up to about 325 million. So when you divide that, you get about 0.012. That is the decimal form of what is 1.2% of basically the population increasing year over year. And when you multiply that by 1,000, you get about 12 people. So that's 12 people per 1,000 that's being born per year. When you multiply that by the average life expectancy, which is about 80 years, give or take, and divide that by 1,000, you get 0.97. So repeat the steps for any country. We're going to look at the table soon. But that's less than 1. And so if it's less than 1, it means that a country will likely decrease in the future. Greater than 1 will likely grow. And if it's equal to 1, it doesn't mean it'll stay stagnant, but it simply means that natural increase. So that birth rate and death rate, and the two combined, has really little to no effect on the increasing population of America. So likely that would be the case of maybe net migration or net immigration. So let's look at a table here. You see Japan has a population momentum factor that's extremely low. In fact, the lowest in this table here. And so you can imagine what issues they're having to deal with, such as maybe welfare policies that are becoming quite costly on the population that's working. And all that money is now having to be fed into an elderly population that's part of the dependent population. That includes both elderly and the young. So people that the working population kind of has to support and pay for. Now, if you go further down, you might see the U.S., which is doing pretty well, around 1. And if you go further down, you might notice some of these countries that we would normally consider to be LEDCs, less economically developed. Their PMFs are really high here, 2.76. And so that is, to a certain extent here, unsustainable. But at the same time, you have to take into consideration that these numbers are going down over time. All right, now looking at a demographic transition model here, we'll explain the stages, but just know that this is just one out of many models, and this one in particular is very Eurocentric. It assumes that countries in Southeast Asia will follow the same pattern, and maybe they won't. And so if you look at stage 1 here, this is way early on when death rates are extremely high. And so in order to maintain their population, people had to give birth to a lot of children, and so birth rates are really high. That was followed by an increase in hygienics and maybe increasing time between wars and more developed countries. This led to a decrease in the CDR, crude death rate. But unfortunately, due to stigma or maybe just population momentum, that birth rate maintains itself. And it's only until stage 3 into which we get maybe Planned Parenthood and birth control. This is becoming more recent in countries like Thailand, where they finally follow in suit with the death rate. So both are now lowered, and by stage 4, we have a pretty stable population with a pretty stable PMF. Now, as always, subscribe and make sure to comment below so I know how to improve these videos. Thank you very much.